What if picking up the wrong person from school accidentally gave you the family you never knew you needed? When a struggling single dad rushes to collect his daughter from her elite private academy and mistakenly takes home a quiet, artistic girl instead, he expects panic, police calls, or at the very least an angry parent demanding their return. Instead, when the billionaire tech mogul mother finally tracks them down 3 hours later, she takes one look at her daughter's genuine smile, the first real one in months, and makes a shocking decision that changes 3 lives forever. She doesn't demand her daughter back. She asks if she can stay too. This is a story about accidental families, the healing power of genuine connection, and discovering that sometimes the biggest mistakes lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The afternoon rain drummed against the windshield of Asher Collins' 15-year-old Honda Civic as he pulled into the circular driveway of Willowbrook Academy, one of the most prestigious private schools in Northern California. His worn work boots squeaked against the brake pedal, and he couldn't help but feel like an imposter among the lineup of gleaming BMWs, Mercedes, and Teslas that filled the pickup lane. The contrast was stark. His paint-splattered contractor, clothes and calloused hands against the backdrop of designer handbags and tailored suits worn by the other parents. Asher checked his phone for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. 3:47 p.m. He was 17 minutes late, and his stomach churned with the familiar anxiety that had become his constant companion since becoming a single father 3 years ago. His daughter Sophie would be waiting, probably fidgeting with her backpack straps and scanning the pickup line for his familiar but embarrassingly modest car. At 12 years old, she'd started noticing things. How their apartment was smaller than her classmates' houses, how her clothes came from discount stores while theirs bore designer labels, how her dad picked her up in a decade-old sedan while her friends climbed into luxury SUVs. The scholarship that allowed Sophie to attend Willowbrook Academy was both a blessing and a burden. Academically, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. Small class sizes, incredible teachers, and resources that public schools could only dream of. Socially, it was a daily reminder of everything they couldn't afford. Asher worked double shifts as a general contractor, taking on plumbing jobs, electrical work, and anything else that paid well enough to keep them afloat. But it never felt like enough. The other parents talked casually about summer homes in Napa Valley and spring break trips to Europe, while Asher clipped coupons and calculated whether they could afford pizza on Friday nights. But Sophie was brilliant, truly brilliant. Her teachers raved about her mathematical mind and her ability to solve complex problems that stumped older students. The scholarship coordinator had called her exceptional and once in a generation, terms that filled Asher with pride, even as they highlighted how out of place he felt in this world of privilege and wealth. He wanted to give her everything, but some days it felt like he could barely give her enough. As he inched forward in the pickup line, Asher's mind wandered to the conversation he'd had with Sophie's guidance counselor the week before. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned that Sophie seemed withdrawn lately, quieter than usual, spending lunch periods alone with her books instead of socializing with her classmates. "She's an extraordinary student," Mrs. Henderson had said gently, "but she might benefit from some additional social connections. Sometimes the scholarship students struggle to find their place among their peers." The words had stung, not because they weren't true, but because they highlighted Asher's deepest fear, that despite all his sacrifices and efforts, he wasn't enough. He couldn't give Sophie the designer clothes or the expensive extracurricular activities that would help her fit in. He couldn't casually write checks for school fundraisers or volunteer during school hours because he was always working. He loved His daughter fiercely, but love didn't pay for piano lessons or gymnastics or the kind of birthday parties that her classmates threw in country club ballrooms. A sharp honk from behind jolted Asher back to the present. The line had moved forward, and he was holding up traffic. He accelerated quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment, as he caught the annoyed glance of a woman in a Range Rover through his rearview mirror. This was exactly the kind of moment that made him feel like he didn't belong here, like he was constantly one mistake away from revealing just how out of his depth he really was. Finally reaching the front of the line, Asher rolled down his window and waved toward the covered area where students waited for pickup. The rain had intensified, creating a curtain of water that made it difficult to see clearly. Through the downpour, he spotted a girl with shoulder-length, brown hair, wearing the school's distinctive navy blazer and plaid skirt. She was standing slightly apart from the other students, a large art portfolio clutched against her chest, her face turned downward as if she was studying something fascinating about the wet pavement. "Sophie!" he called out, raising his voice. Above the sound of the rain, the girl looked up, seemed to hesitate for a moment, then hurried toward the car. Asher leaned over to push open the passenger door, his mind already racing ahead to their evening routine. Homework at the kitchen table, a simple dinner, maybe a movie if they finished everything early. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. "Sorry, I'm late, sweetheart," he said, as the girl slid into the passenger seat, bringing with her the scent of rain and something else he couldn't identify. Expensive perfume, perhaps, or high-end hair products. Traffic was brutal, and I had to finish up this electrical job that ran longer than expected. You know how it is. The girl nodded quietly, settling her art portfolio carefully between her feet and buckling her seatbelt. Asher glanced over at her as he pulled away from the curb, noting that she seemed smaller than usual, more delicate somehow. Sophie had been going through a growth spurt lately, becoming all arms and legs like a young colt. But today, she seemed to have shrunk back into herself. "How was school today?" he asked, following their usual routine as he navigated through the maze of luxury vehicles leaving the academy grounds. "Did you get your math test back? I know you were worried about that geometry unit." Another quiet nod, but no verbal response. This wasn't entirely unusual. Sophie sometimes needed time to decompress after school, especially on days when the social dynamics felt particularly challenging. Asher had learned to give her space while still letting her know he was available if she wanted to talk. As they drove through the affluent neighborhood surrounding Willowbrook Academy, past manicured lawns and houses that looked like they belonged in architectural magazines, Asher found himself thinking about the future. Sophie would be starting high school in just 2 years, and the academic pressure would only intensify. He'd heard other parents talking about SAT prep courses that cost thousands of dollars, college consultants who charged more per hour than he made in a day, and summer programs at prestigious universities that were essentially mandatory for students, hoping to get into top colleges. The weight of it all pressed down on his shoulders like a physical burden. How could he possibly compete with parents who had unlimited resources and connections that opened doors before their children even knocked? How could he ensure that Sophie's brilliant mind would have every opportunity to flourish when he was already stretching every dollar just to keep them housed and fed? But as he glanced over at the quiet girl beside him, something stirred in his chest. A fierce protectiveness and determination that had carried him through 3 years of single parenthood. Sophie was worth every sacrifice, every double shift, every moment of feeling out of place among the wealthy families at her school. She was his daughter, his pride and joy, and he would move mountains to give her the best possible future, even if it meant he never quite fit into her world. What Asher didn't know, as he drove through the rain-soaked streets toward their modest apartment across town, was that the quiet girl sitting beside him wasn't Sophie at all. And in a few hours, when the truth was revealed, this simple case of mistaken identity would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the lives of two other people who desperately needed exactly what he had to offer: a genuine heart, unconditional love, and the kind of family that money could never buy. 23 floors above the bustling streets of downtown San Francisco, Natalie Price stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her corner office, watching the same rain that had complicated Asher's school pickup create rivulets down the glass, like tears she never allowed herself to shed. The view from Price Technologies' headquarters was breathtaking, the Golden Gate Bridge emerging and disappearing through wisps of fog, the bay stretching endlessly toward the horizon, the city sprawling below like a circuit board of lights and possibilities. It was the kind of view that most people would kill for, the tangible proof of everything she'd built from nothing more than lines of code and relentless determination. But today, like most days lately, the view felt more like a prison than a prize. At 34, Natalie had achieved what most entrepreneurs only dreamed of. Her cybersecurity company, built from her Stanford dorm room with nothing but student loan money and an innovative algorithm she'd developed during a particularly brutal all-nighter, was now worth over $3 billion. Forbes had named her one of the youngest self-made billionaires in tech. Time magazine had featured her on their cover with the headline, "The Woman Who Made the Internet Safer." She had everything that society said should make her happy: wealth beyond measure, professional recognition, power, influence, and a sprawling penthouse that had been featured in Architectural Digest. Preparing and narrating this story took a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Everything except the one thing that mattered most to her 12-year-old daughter, Isabella. Natalie's reflection in the rain-streaked window showed a woman who looked polished and put together from the outside. Her dark hair pulled into a sleek chignon, her tailored Armani suit fitting perfectly, her makeup applied with the precision of someone who understood that image was part of the business. But her eyes told a different story. They held the exhaustion of someone who hadn't had a genuine conversation with another adult in months. The loneliness of someone who'd traded almost everything for professional success, and the guilt of a mother who knew she was failing at the one job that truly mattered. Her phone buzzed against the glass surface of her minimalist desk, and she turned reluctantly to check the notification. Another meeting request, another investor call, another opportunity that would require her attention and take her away from the one person who needed her most. She'd missed Isabella's art show last month because of an emergency board meeting. She'd had to send her assistant to parent-teacher conferences because she was in London launching their European expansion. She'd even missed Isabella's birthday dinner because a critical security breach at a major client required her immediate attention. Each missed moment felt like another brick in the wall that seemed to be growing between her and her daughter, and Natalie felt powerless to stop it. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built a company that protected millions of people from digital threats, but she couldn't protect her own daughter from the emotional neglect that came with having a workaholic mother. Isabella had started spending more and more time in her art studio at home, a converted bedroom where she painted and sketched and created worlds that didn't include her mother's constant absence. The few times they did spend together were awkward, filled with Natalie's clumsy attempts to connect and Isabella's polite but distant responses. Her daughter was slipping away from her, becoming a stranger in their shared but emotionally empty penthouse. The separation from Isabella's father hadn't helped matters. David had been a fellow Stanford student, brilliant in his own right, but lacking the ruthless drive that had propelled Natalie to the top of the tech world. When Isabella was 3, David had asked Natalie to choose: scale back her growing company and focus on their family, or watch him leave with their daughter. He'd thought it would be an easy choice, that motherhood and love would triumph over ambition and success. He'd been wrong. Natalie had fought for joint custody and won, but David had been right about one thing. You couldn't build an empire and be present for bedtime stories. You couldn't revolutionize an industry and still make it to every soccer game. The demands of running a billion-dollar company meant that even when Isabella was with her, Natalie was usually distracted by calls, emails, and the constant pressure of staying ahead in an industry that moved at the speed of light. The worst, in part, was that Isabella had stopped complaining about it. 3 years ago, she'd begged her mother to come to school events, had cried when Natalie had to cancel their weekend plans, had pleaded for just one day where work wouldn't interrupt their time together. But lately, Isabella had stopped asking. She'd learned to expect disappointment, and her quiet acceptance of her mother's absence was somehow more heartbreaking than her previous protests had been. Natalie's assistant, Marcus, knocked softly on the office door before entering with his usual efficiency. He was in his 50s, impeccably organized, and had been with the company since its early days when they operated out of a cramped office space south of Market Street. He'd seen Natalie through her divorce, her company's IPO, and countless crises, both professional and personal. If anyone understood the price she'd paid for her success, it was Marcus. "The Tokyo call is in 10 minutes, he said, setting a fresh cup of coffee on her desk, along with a folder of documents that needed her review. "And Isabella's school called again about pickup. She's been waiting for 20 minutes. The guilt hit Natalie like a physical blow. She'd completely forgotten about the early dismissal day, too absorbed in preparing for the international expansion meeting to remember that her daughter needed to be collected at 3:30 instead of the usual 4:15. This was exactly the kind of moment that would add another layer to Isabella's growing resentment, another proof that work would always come first in her mother's priorities. "Cancel the Tokyo call," Natalie said suddenly, surprising both Marcus and herself. "Reschedule it for tonight. I need to get Isabella." Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't question the decision. He'd worked for Natalie long enough to know that her moments of maternal clarity were rare and should be encouraged. "I'll handle it. The car is waiting downstairs." As Natalie gathered her things and headed toward the elevator, she tried to push down the familiar anxiety that always accompanied her interactions with Isabella's school. Willowbrook Academy was filled with parents who seemed to have it all figured out. Mothers who volunteered for every fundraiser, who knew all the other parents' names, who never missed a school event because of a work crisis. Natalie felt like an imposter among them, wealthy enough to afford the tuition, but too busy to be the kind of parent the school community seemed to expect. The drive to Willowbrook Academy took longer than usual due to the rain and traffic, giving Natalie time to rehearse what she'd say to Isabella. Maybe they could go for ice cream afterward, or visit that art supply store Isabella loved downtown. Maybe they could finally have the conversation about why Mommy worked so much, why the company was important, not just for them, but for all the people whose digital security depended on the innovations Natalie's team created. But even as she planned their afternoon together, Natalie's phone continued to buzz with urgent messages and missed calls. The Tokyo investors were frustrated about the rescheduled meeting. A potential security breach at a client company needed immediate attention. A competitor had just announced a product launch that could threaten their market share. The constant demands of her success pulled at her attention like gravity, making it nearly impossible to be fully present, even when she was trying to prioritize her daughter. When Natalie finally arrived at Willowbrook Academy, the pickup line was nearly empty, and she could see Isabella waiting under the covered area, her art portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. Even from a distance, Natalie could see the resignation in her daughter's posture, the way Isabella had learned to wait patiently for a mother who was always running late, always stressed, always mentally somewhere else. As she pulled up to the curb, Natalie made a silent promise to herself and to Isabella. Things would change. She would find a way to be more present, more available, more like the mother her brilliant, artistic, sensitive daughter deserved. She would prove that success didn't have to mean sacrificing the relationships that mattered most. But when Isabella didn't emerge from the covered area, when minutes passed without her daughter appearing at the car door, Natalie felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She parked and walked toward the school entrance, her heels clicking against the wet pavement, her heart beginning to race with a fear that had nothing to do with market volatility or competitive threats. Isabella was nowhere to be found, and in that moment, as panic began to override every other thought in her mind, Natalie realized that all the money in the world, all the professional success and recognition and power meant absolutely nothing if she couldn't protect the one person who mattered more than anything else in her carefully constructed but emotionally barren world. The modest two-bedroom apartment that Asher and Sophie called home was a world away. From the gleaming towers of downtown San Francisco, nestled in a working-class neighborhood where the houses were smaller, the cars older, and the dreams more practical. The building was from the 1970s, with thin walls and creaky floors, but Asher had spent countless evenings making it feel like home, painting the walls in warm colors, fixing the leaky faucets himself, and creating cozy spaces where he and Sophie could build their life together. As Asher pulled into the narrow parking space behind their building, he glanced over at the girl, who had been unusually quiet during the 20-minute drive. The rain was still falling steadily, drumming against the roof of the Honda with a rhythmic intensity that seemed to match the growing unease in his chest. Something felt different today, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what it was. "All right, kiddo," he said, turning off the engine and grabbing his work bag from the back seat. "Let's get inside before we get completely soaked. I picked up some of those frozen dumplings you like, the ones from Trader Joe's. We can have them for dinner while you work on homework." The girl nodded silently, carefully gathering her art portfolio and following him toward the building's entrance. Asher fumbled with his keys, trying to balance his bag while shielding them both from the rain with his jacket. It wasn't until they were safely inside the apartment, with the door closed behind them and the familiar warmth of home surrounding them, that he really looked at her. And that's when he realized something was very, very wrong. The girl standing in his living room was holding her art portfolio with a delicacy that Sophie never showed toward her school supplies. Her posture was straighter, more refined somehow, and when she looked around the apartment, there was a curious wonder in her eyes that didn't match Sophie's familiar comfort with their space. Most telling of all, when she smiled at him, a small, tentative expression. It wasn't Sophie's smile at all. "Oh my God," Asher breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "You're not Sophie." The girl, whoever she was, looked up at him with large, intelligent eyes that held a mixture of uncertainty and something that looked almost like relief. She shook her head slowly, her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "I'm Isabella," she said quietly. "Isabella Price. I think there might have been a mistake." Asher felt his knees go weak. He sank onto the edge of the couch, his mind racing through the implications of what had just happened. He had kidnapped someone's daughter. Accidentally, yes, but the police wouldn't care about his intentions when they came looking for a missing 12-year-old from one of the most expensive private schools in California. "Isabella," he repeated, trying to keep his voice calm, even as panic clawed at his chest. Where is my daughter Sophie? Do you know Sophie Collins?" Isabella nodded, setting down her art portfolio with careful precision. "She was in the library. She stays after school on Fridays to work on the computers because," she paused, seeming to choose her words carefully, Because she said the ones at home are older. The innocent observation stung, not because it wasn't true, but because it highlighted once again the financial gap between Asher's world and the world Sophie inhabited at school. But there were more pressing concerns at the moment than his bruised, "Your pride, I need to call the school," Asher said, reaching for his phone with trembling hands. "They need to know where you are, and I need to find Sophie. Your parents must be worried sick." But even as he started to dial, Isabella's voice stopped him. "My mom probably doesn't know yet," she said matter-of-factly. "She's usually in meetings, until late. She might not even realize I'm supposed to be picked up today." There was something heartbreaking about the casual way Isabella stated this, as if her mother's absence was simply a fact of life she'd learned to accept. Asher looked at her more closely, taking in the expensive clothes, the perfectly styled hair, the subtle signs of wealth that he'd somehow missed in his rain-soaked confusion at the school. This was clearly a girl from a very different world than his own. "Well, someone needs to know where you are," Asher said, his contractor's practical nature taking over despite his panic. "What's your mom's phone number? Or your dad's?" Isabella recited a number from memory, and Asher dialed it with hands that were steadier than he felt. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. A professional, polished voice informed him that he'd reached Natalie Price, CEO of Price Technologies, and invited him to leave a detailed message. "Ms. Price," Asher said after the beep, his voice strained with anxiety. "This is Asher Collins. There's been a mistake. I accidentally picked up your daughter Isabella from Willowbrook Academy instead of my daughter Sophie. Isabella is safe. She's with me, but I thought you should know. Please call me back as soon as you get this." He rattled off his phone number twice and hung up. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Asher looked at Isabella, who was standing in the middle of his modest living room, like a delicate piece of art that had been accidentally delivered to the wrong gallery. She was clearly expensive. Everything about her, from her perfectly fitted school uniform to her high-quality art supplies, spoke of money and privilege. And here she was, in his threadbare apartment with its second-hand furniture and the lingering smell of the paint he'd used to cover water stains on the ceiling. "Are you hungry?" Asher asked, because it seemed like the most normal thing he could think of to say. "I could make you a snack while we wait for your mom to call back." Isabella nodded, and something in her expression shifted. For the first time, since they'd entered the apartment, she looked less like a lost princess and more like what she was, a 12-year-old girl who had just been through a confusing and potentially frightening experience. "Could I see your kitchen?" she asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice. "I mean, if that's okay." Asher led her to the small galley kitchen, which was clean, but clearly showing its age. The appliances were from the previous decade. The countertops were laminate instead of granite, and the whole space could probably fit inside the walk-in pantry of the kind of house Isabella was likely used to. But Isabella looked around with interest, not judgment. "Do you cook a lot?" she asked, running her fingers along the edge of the counter. "Every day," Asher replied, pulling a bag of pretzels from the cabinet and setting it on the counter along with 2 glasses of water. "It's cheaper than eating out, and Sophie and I like to try new recipes sometimes. Nothing fancy, but we make it work." Isabella accepted the snack gratefully, and as she ate, Asher found himself studying her more carefully. Despite her expensive clothes and obvious privilege, there was something lonely about her, a quality that reminded him uncomfortably of Sophie's recent withdrawal. Both girls seemed to be carrying weights that were too heavy for their young shoulders, just in very different ways. "Can I ask you something?" Isabella said suddenly, her voice hesitant. "Of course. When you picked me up from school, you seemed really happy to see me, like genuinely happy. Even though you thought I was Sophie, you were smiling and asking about my day and..." She trailed off, looking down at her hands. Asher felt his heart clench. "That's what parents are supposed to do, sweetheart. We're supposed to be happy to see you, to care about your day, to want to know how you're doing." Isabella looked up at him with eyes that seemed far too old for her 12 years. "My mom is really busy," she said quietly. "She's very important. She's saving the world from cyber attacks and stuff. She doesn't really have time for asking about my day." The matter-of-fact way she said it, without anger or self-pity, somehow made it worse. Asher had seen this before in some of Sophie's classmates. Children who had learned to accept emotional neglect as the price of their parents' success. He sat down across from Isabella at the small kitchen table, searching for the right words. "I'm sure your mom loves you very much," he said carefully. "Sometimes adults get so focused on work that they forget the most important things are right in front of them." Isabella nodded, but her expression suggested she'd heard similar explanations before. "She missed my art show last month and my birthday dinner. Marcus, that's her assistant, he came to my parent-teacher conference instead of her." Each revelation was like a small knife to Asher's heart. This girl, with all her material advantages, was starving for the very thing he tried to give Sophie every day: attention, presence, the simple knowledge that she mattered more than anything else in the world. Before he could respond, his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. His heart leaped into his throat as he answered. "Hello? This is Natalie Price," came a voice that was clearly strained with panic and barely controlled fear. "You have my daughter." "Miss Price, yes. Isabella is here and she's perfectly safe," Asher said quickly. "There was a misunderstanding at the school pickup and—" "Where are you?" she interrupted, her voice sharp with the kind of authority that was accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm coming to get her right now." Asher gave her his address, and she hung up without another word. He looked at Isabella, who had heard enough of the conversation to understand that her time in this strange, warm little apartment was about to come to an end. "She's coming to get you," he said gently. Isabella nodded, but for just a moment he could have sworn he saw disappointment flicker across her face. And in that instant, Asher realized that this accidental encounter was about to become something much more significant than a simple case of mistaken identity. 3 lives were about to collide in ways that none of them could possibly anticipate, and the reverberations would change everything. Natalie Price's hands gripped the steering wheel of her midnight blue Tesla Model S with white-knuckled intensity as she navigated through the unfamiliar streets of Asher's neighborhood. The GPS had guided her away from the gleaming towers and manicured landscapes of downtown San Francisco through increasingly modest residential areas where the houses grew smaller and closer together, where corner markets replaced boutique shops, and where the carefully curated perfection of her usual world gave way to something more authentic and lived in. This was not a part of the city she ever had reason to visit. Her penthouse, her office, Isabella's school, the country club where she occasionally met clients, all of these existed in a bubble of affluence that rarely required her to venture beyond the invisible boundaries of wealth and privilege. But now, driven by a mother's desperation and the overwhelming need to hold her daughter again, she found herself entering a world that felt foreign and somehow more real than anything she'd experienced in years. The address led her to a modest apartment complex built sometime in the 1970s, its beige stucco exterior weathered but well-maintained. Children's bikes were chained to the stair railings, and small gardens in mismatched pots lined the walkways. It was the kind of place where working families built their lives with careful budgets and big hearts, where community meant knowing your neighbors' names and watching out for each other's children. Natalie parked her Tesla between a 15-year-old Honda Civic and an even older pickup truck, the luxury vehicle looking absurdly out of place in the humble setting. As she stepped out of the car, her designer heels clicking against the asphalt, she became acutely aware of how she must appear to anyone watching. A wealthy woman in an expensive suit, clearly out of her element, probably looking down on everything around her. But the truth was quite the opposite. As she climbed the exterior stairs to apartment 2B, Natalie felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of authenticity, of real life being lived without pretense or performance. The sounds drifting from the various apartments weren't the careful silence of her penthouse building, where everyone was too polite or too busy to acknowledge each other's existence. Here she could hear laughter, conversations in multiple languages, the sounds of families actually living together. When she reached the door marked 2B, Natalie paused for a moment, her hand raised to knock. Through the thin walls, she could hear voices. A man's voice, warm and patient, and Isabella's voice, more animated than Natalie had heard it in months. Her daughter was talking, actually engaging in conversation, and the sound sent an unexpected pang through Natalie's chest. She knocked, and the voices inside immediately quieted. Footsteps approached the door, and then it opened to reveal a man in his early 30s with kind eyes, work-roughened hands, and paint stains on his jeans. This was clearly the contractor who had accidentally taken her daughter, and Natalie's first instinct was to demand Isabella back and leave immediately. But then Isabella appeared behind him, and Natalie's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter was smiling. Not the polite, practiced smile she'd learned to wear at school functions and family gatherings, but a genuine, unguarded expression of contentment. Her usually perfect hair was slightly mussed, as if she'd been comfortable enough to relax her rigid posture. Most remarkably, her shoulders weren't carrying their usual tension, the subtle stress that Natalie had noticed building over the past months, but hadn't known how to address. "Mom," Isabella said, and there was surprise in her voice, but not the relief Natalie had expected. "You came really fast." "Of course I came fast," Natalie replied, stepping into the apartment and immediately pulling Isabella into a fierce hug. "I was terrified. When I got to school and you weren't there." She couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of that panic, still too fresh and raw. Over Isabella's shoulder, Natalie took in the apartment's interior. It was small, probably a quarter the size of her penthouse, but it radiated warmth in a way her expensive home never had. The furniture was clearly second-hand, but well cared for, arranged to maximize the limited space while creating cozy areas for conversation and relaxation. Children's artwork was displayed on the refrigerator with pride, and books were stacked on every available surface, not the leather-bound volumes that decorated her penthouse for show, but well-worn paperbacks that had clearly been read and reread. "Ms. Price," Asher said quietly, and she could hear the nervousness in his voice. "I'm so sorry about this mix-up. I know how frightening it must have been for you. Isabella has been perfectly safe, and I've been trying to reach the school to find out where my daughter Sophie is." Natalie released Isabella from the hug, but kept her hands on her daughter's shoulders, as if physical contact could somehow prevent her from disappearing again. "What exactly happened?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Asher explained the confusion at the pickup line, the rain that had made visibility poor, his assumption that Isabella was Sophie. As he spoke, Natalie found herself studying him more carefully. There was something genuine about him, an authenticity that she rarely encountered in her professional world. He wasn't trying to impress her or manage the situation for his own benefit. He was simply a concerned parent who had made an honest mistake and was genuinely worried about both children involved. "Have you been able to reach the school?" Natalie asked, her business executive instincts taking over. "We need to make sure Sophie is safe and knows where to go." "I've left 3 messages, but the main office is closed for the day," Asher replied. "I'm hoping she's still in the library where Isabella saw her. Sophie sometimes stays late to use the computers for homework." The casual mention of Sophie staying late to use school computers because the ones at home were older struck Natalie with unexpected force. She lived in a world where technology was constantly upgraded, where the latest devices were simply tools of convenience rather than precious resources. The idea that a brilliant child might be limited by her family's financial constraints was both foreign and heartbreaking to her. "I could call the school," Natalie offered. "Sometimes they respond more quickly to certain inquiries." She didn't say it explicitly, but they all understood. Her wealth and influence could open doors that remained closed to working-class parents. But before Asher could respond, Isabella spoke up. "Mom, Mr. Collins made me a snack," and he showed me his kitchen. "Did you know he cooks dinner every night? Real cooking, not just ordering from restaurants." There was wonder in Isabella's voice, as if the concept of daily home cooking was as exotic to her as space travel. Natalie realized with a sinking feeling that her daughter was right. Their meals were almost always catered affairs, restaurant deliveries, or prepared foods heated in their gourmet kitchen by their housekeeper. When was the last time Natalie had actually cooked something for Isabella herself? That's very nice," Natalie said weakly, unsure how to respond to her daughter's enthusiasm for something so ordinary, yet apparently foreign to their own lives. "And look," Isabella continued, pulling her mother toward a small dining area where her art portfolio lay open on the table. "Mr. Collins asked about my art. He wanted to see what I've been working on." Natalie looked down at the portfolio and felt another stab of guilt. She couldn't remember the last time she'd asked to see Isabella's artwork, despite knowing how passionate her daughter was about painting and drawing. Isabella's schedule was managed by their household staff. Her art supplies were replenished by assistants, and her creative pursuits had somehow become just another item on a list of activities that kept her occupied while Natalie worked. But here, in this modest apartment, a stranger had taken the time to show genuine interest in Isabella's passion. The sketches spread across the table were beautiful. Delicate watercolors of flowers and trees, detailed pencil drawings of birds and butterflies, and abstract pieces that showed remarkable sophistication for a 12-year-old artist. "These are extraordinary, Isabella," Natalie said softly, and she meant it. "When did you create this one?" She pointed to a particularly striking painting of a sunset over water. "Last week," Isabella replied, her voice growing more animated. "I was trying to capture the way the light looked from my bedroom window during that storm we had. You know, when the clouds were all dramatic and the sun was trying to break through?" Natalie nodded, though she realized with shame that she had no memory of that storm or that sunset. She'd probably been working late that evening, her attention focused on quarterly reports or strategic planning sessions rather than the natural beauty that had inspired her daughter's art. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. But the words felt inadequate, a poor substitute for months of absent attention and missed opportunities to celebrate Isabella's talents. Asher had been quietly observing this interaction, and now he stepped forward with a gentle smile. "Isabella, as real talent," he said. "Sophie loves art too, though she's more into digital design. Maybe they could show each other their work sometime." The suggestion hung in the air, carrying implications that none of them were quite ready to examine. It suggested future contact, ongoing connection, a relationship that extended beyond this single, accidental encounter. Natalie felt herself pulled in two directions. Her instinct was to collect Isabella and return to their familiar world of scheduled activities and professional obligations. But another part of her recognized that something important was happening. Here, something her daughter needed that their wealthy, isolated existence wasn't providing. As if sensing her mother's internal struggle, Isabella looked up at her with eyes that held a question she was too young to articulate. Could they stay a little longer in this place, where she felt seen and valued for who she was, rather than what she represented? And for the first time in years, Natalie found herself wondering if everything she'd built in the name of providing for her daughter's future had somehow cost them both the very thing Isabella needed most: a sense of genuine connection and belonging. Natalie's phone buzzed insistently in her purse, the familiar sound of urgent business pulling her back from the uncomfortable revelations swirling in her mind. She glanced at the screen and saw Marcus's name, along with several missed calls and messages that undoubtedly contained crises requiring her immediate attention. The familiar weight of responsibility settled back onto her shoulders like a heavy coat she'd momentarily forgotten she was wearing. "I should take this," she said apologetically, stepping toward the apartment's small balcony. "It's work." But as she moved to answer the call, Isabella's voice stopped her. "It's always work," her daughter said quietly, not accusingly, but with the resignation of someone who had learned not to expect otherwise. The words hit Natalie like a physical blow, especially here in this warm apartment where a stranger had just spent an hour giving Isabella the kind of attention that should have been coming from her own mother. She let the call go to voicemail and slowly put her phone back in her purse. "You're right," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It is always work." Asher, sensing the tension in the moment, cleared his throat gently. "Ms. Price, I was thinking, since we still haven't located Sophie and it's getting late, maybe we should try calling some of her classmates' parents. Isabella might know who Sophie usually talks to at school." Natalie seized on this practical suggestion, grateful for something concrete to focus on rather than the emotional minefield she'd been navigating. "Of course, that's a good idea. Isabella, do you know Sophie's friends?" Isabella shifted uncomfortably, her earlier animation fading slightly. "Sophie doesn't really. She kind of keeps to herself at school. She's really smart, but she's in different classes than most of the other kids our age because of the advanced program." "What about at lunch or during free periods?" Natalie pressed, her business-focused mind trying to solve this problem efficiently. "She usually goes to the library," Isabella said softly. "Sometimes I see her there, reading or working on the computers. She's always by herself, but she seems to like it that way." The description painted a picture that made Asher's face tighten with concern. He'd known Sophie was struggling socially at Willowbrook, but hearing it confirmed by another student made his worst fears feel more real. His brilliant, wonderful daughter was isolated at school, spending her days surrounded by wealth and privilege she couldn't share, trying to find her place in a world where she didn't quite belong. "Maybe I should just go back to the school and check the library," Asher said, running his hand through his hair anxiously. "If she's still there, she's probably worried about where I am." "I'll drive you," Natalie said immediately, the executive in her taking charge of the situation. "My car is faster, and I can call the school's after-hours security line on the way." But even as she made this practical offer, Natalie felt her phone buzzing again, reminding her of the meetings she was missing, the decisions that were being made without her input, the carefully orchestrated machinery of her business empire that required her constant oversight. The tension between her roles as CEO and mother felt particularly acute in this moment, with Isabella watching her every move for signs of which priority would win out. "Actually," Asher said, studying Natalie's face with unexpected perceptiveness, "maybe it would be better if Isabella stayed here while we go look for Sophie. That way, if she comes back to the apartment looking for me, someone will be here." It was a practical suggestion, but Natalie's immediate reaction was pure protective instinct. "Absolutely not. I'm not leaving Isabella with someone I just met, no matter how nice you seem." The words came out harsher than she intended, and she saw both Asher and Isabella flinch slightly. She'd just insulted the man who had cared for her daughter for hours, fed her, shown interest in her art, and created the first genuine smile Natalie had seen on Isabella's face in months. "Mom," Isabella said quietly, "Mr. Collins is really kind. He made me feel safe when I was scared about being in the wrong place." "I'm sure he is," Natalie replied, her voice tight with the stress of trying to maintain control in a situation that felt increasingly beyond her management. "But I don't know him, and I'm not comfortable leaving you with a stranger." "But you leave me with strangers all the time," Isabella said, and there was no anger in her voice, just a matter-of-fact observation that cut deeper than any accusation could have. "You leave me with babysitters and tutors and drivers and people at after-school programs. At least Mr. Collins actually talked to me." The truth in Isabella's words created a silence that stretched uncomfortably through the small apartment. Natalie realized that her daughter was right. She regularly entrusted Isabella's care to paid employees, people whose qualifications she'd verified through background checks and references, but whom she often knew less personally than she now knew. Asher Collins. Asher, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension his presence had inadvertently created, spoke carefully. "I understand your concerns, Ms. Price. As a parent, I'd feel the same way. Why don't we all go together? We can. Take both cars. That way Isabella stays with you, and we can split up to search more efficiently if needed." It was a reasonable compromise, and Natalie felt herself nodding before she'd fully processed the suggestion. But as they prepared to leave, her phone rang again, and this time the caller ID showed her board chairman's name. This wasn't a call she could ignore. The board was meeting an emergency session about a potential acquisition that could affect thousands of jobs and millions of dollars in company value. "I have to take this," she said, and the old familiar panic crept into her voice. "It's the board chairman. There's a situation with a major deal, and if I don't—" "Mom." Isabella's voice was quiet but firm. "Sophie is missing. Isn't that more important than another meeting?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Natalie looked at her daughter, really looked at her, and saw something she'd been missing for months. Isabella wasn't just asking about this moment. She was asking about all the moments when work had come first, when business crises had taken precedence over birthday dinners and art shows, and the simple daily question of how her daughter's day had gone. Asher watched this exchange with growing understanding. He recognized the look on Natalie's face because he'd seen it in his own mirror during the first months after Sophie's mother had left them. The overwhelming weight of responsibility, the impossible choice between providing for his daughter's future and being present for her childhood, the constant fear that he was failing at the one job that mattered most. "The call can wait," he said gently, finding Sophie can't. Natalie looked at him in surprise. In her world, suggesting that business could wait for personal matters was practically heretical. Her success had been built on being available 24 hours a day, on treating every crisis as if the company's survival depended on her immediate response. But looking at Isabella's face, seeing the hope and disappointment warring in her daughter's eyes, Natalie made a choice that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. She declined the call and put her phone on silent. "You're right," she said, her voice shaky with the magnitude of what she'd just done. "Finding Sophie is more important." Isabella's face lit up with an expression of such pure surprise and joy that Natalie felt her heart crack a little. When had her daughter stopped expecting her mother to choose her over work? When had Isabella learned to settle for being second priority in her own mother's life? "Really?" Isabella asked, as if she couldn't quite believe it. "Really?" Natalie confirmed, and for the first time in years, she felt like she was making a decision as a mother rather than as a CEO. "Let's go find Sophie." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave the apartment, Natalie caught Asher looking at her with something that might have been approval. It was a small thing, this decision to prioritize a missing girl over a board meeting, but it felt like the first step toward becoming the kind of mother Isabella deserved. The kind of mother she'd always meant to be, before success and ambition. And the intoxicating drug of being indispensable had gradually stolen her attention away from the person who needed her most. And as they headed out into the evening to search for Sophie, Natalie found herself thinking that maybe, just maybe, this accidental encounter was exactly what both she and Isabella had needed. A reminder that the most important things in life couldn't be scheduled into calendar appointments or delegated to assistants. They had to be lived, moment by moment, choice by choice, with the people who mattered most. The ride back to Willowbrook Academy in Natalie's Tesla was unlike any car trip Isabella could remember taking with her mother. Instead of Natalie conducting conference calls through the car's Bluetooth system or dictating emails to her voice assistant, she was actually present, asking questions, listening to answers, and engaging in the kind of conversation that Isabella had almost forgotten they used to have. "Tell me about Sophie," Natalie said, as they followed Asher's Honda through the tree-lined streets toward the school. "What's she like?" Isabella considered the question carefully, twisting a strand of hair around her finger the way she did when she was thinking deeply. "She's really smart, like scary smart. The teachers are always talking about how gifted she is. But she's also really quiet at school. I think she feels different from everyone else." "Different how?" Natalie asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. "Well, most of the kids at Willowbrook, their families have a lot of money. They talk about vacations to Europe and private tennis lessons and stuff like that. Sophie never talks about any of that. She just focuses on her schoolwork and tries not to stand out." Natalie felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach, the same feeling she'd had when she was Isabella's age, a scholarship student at an elite prep school where she'd never quite fit in despite her academic achievements. She'd channeled that feeling of being an outsider into fierce determination to succeed, to prove that she belonged in any room she entered. But for a 12-year-old girl, the isolation must feel overwhelming. "Do you ever talk to her?" Natalie asked. "Sometimes," Isabella admitted. "We're both in the advanced art program, so we see each other in the studio. She's really good at digital design. She creates these amazing graphics on the computer. But she always seems like she's in her own world, you know? Like she's thinking about things the rest of us aren't even aware of." As they pulled into the school parking lot, Natalie noticed that Asher's old Honda looked even more out of place among the luxury vehicles that still dotted the lot. Parents arriving for evening events, late pickups from after-school activities, the casual display of wealth that was simply part of Willowbrook's culture. She wondered how many times Asher had felt the weight of that contrast, how many times Sophie had noticed the difference between her family's circumstances and those of her classmates. The school building itself was impressive even in the evening. Light, colonial architecture with modern additions, perfectly maintained grounds, the kind of institution that promised its students entry to the best universities and the most exclusive opportunities. It was exactly the kind of environment Natalie had wanted for Isabella, a place where excellence was expected and resources were unlimited. But as she watched Asher park his car and walk toward them with visible anxiety etched across his face, she began to wonder if she'd been measuring success by the wrong metrics. Asher clearly adored his daughter, was present in her life in ways that Natalie had never managed to be with Isabella, and had created a home filled with warmth and genuine connection. Did it matter that he couldn't afford the designer clothes and expensive vacations that Isabella's classmates took for granted? "The library is in the main building," Isabella said as they approached the school's entrance. "Third floor, past the science labs." Asher had called ahead and reached the night security guard, who had agreed to let them search for Sophie. The guard, a kind man in his 60s named Frank, met them at the main entrance with a ring of keys and a concerned expression. "I did a sweep about an hour ago and didn't see anyone in the library," Frank said as he led them through the quiet hallways. "But it's a big space with lots of hiding spots. Sometimes the kids find corners where they can read without being noticed." The school felt different at night. larger somehow, with shadows stretching down hallways that bustled with activity during the day. Their footsteps echoed against the polished floors, and Isabella instinctively moved closer to her mother, a gesture that surprised them both with its naturalness. When they reached the library, Frank unlocked the doors and turned on the lights, revealing a space that was impressive even by Willowbrook's high standards. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the campus grounds, comfortable reading areas were scattered throughout the space, and state-of-the-art computer stations lined one wall. It was the kind of library that made learning feel like a privilege, rather than a chore. "Sophie?" Asher called out, his voice carrying clearly through the quiet space. "Sophie, are you here? It's Dad." For a moment, there was only silence. Then from a reading nook tucked behind the reference section came a small voice. "Dad." Relief flooded Asher's face as he hurried toward the voice, with Natalie and Isabella close behind. They found Sophie curled up in an oversized armchair, surrounded by books and with a laptop balanced on her knees. She looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed from crying, her usually neat hair disheveled, her school uniform wrinkled from hours of sitting in the same position. "Oh, sweetheart," Asher said, dropping to his knees beside the chair and pulling Sophie into a fierce hug. "I was so worried about you. I'm so sorry I was late picking you up." Sophie clung to her father with the desperate relief of a child who had been trying to be brave for too long. "I didn't know where you were," she whispered into his shoulder. "I waited and waited, and then all the other kids were gone, and I thought maybe you forgot about me." "I could never forget about you," Asher said firmly, stroking her hair with gentle hands. "Never, ever. There was just a mix-up at pickup and I accidentally took the wrong person home." Sophie pulled back to look at him with confusion, and that's when she noticed Natalie and Isabella standing nearby. Her eyes widened as she took in Natalie's expensive suit and Isabella's presence, clearly trying to piece together what had happened. "Sophie," Isabella said softly, stepping forward with an awkward but genuine smile. "I'm really sorry. Your dad thought I was you because of the rain and everything. He was really worried when he figured out the mistake." Sophie looked between Isabella and her father, her quick mind already understanding the situation. "You went to our apartment?" she asked Isabella with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Yeah," Isabella replied. "Your dad made me a snack and asked about my art. He was really nice." There was something in the way Isabella said it, a wistfulness, that suggested she wasn't used to adults taking such immediate, genuine interest in her well-being. Natalie felt another stab of guilt as she realized that Isabella was describing basic parental behavior as if it were remarkable. "Are you okay?" Sophie asked Isabella, with the kind of empathy that seemed natural to her. "Were you scared when you realized you were with a stranger?" "At first," Isabella admitted, "but your dad made me feel safe really quickly, and your apartment is really cozy. I liked it." Sophie smiled for the first time since they'd found her. "Dad's good at making people feel safe." The simple statement carried profound weight, and Natalie found herself looking at Asher with new eyes. Here was a man who had somehow managed to make a frightened 12-year-old feel secure within minutes of meeting her, who had fed her and shown interest in her passions, who had called frantically to find his own daughter while ensuring that someone else's remained comfortable and cared for. When was the last time Isabella had described Natalie as someone who made her feel safe? When had her own daughter last felt comfortable enough to confide in her about fears or dreams or the simple events of her daily life? "I'm Natalie Price," she said, stepping forward and extending her hand to Sophie. "Isabella's mother. I want to thank you for being so understanding about this mix-up. And I'm very glad you're safe." Sophie shook her hand with a maturity that seemed beyond her years. "Nice to meet you, Ms. Price. I hope Isabella wasn't too much trouble." "She was wonderful," Natalie said, and meant it. "She showed me some of her artwork, and she was very patient while we figured out where you were." As they gathered Sophie's things and prepared to leave the library, Natalie found herself watching the interaction between the two girls with growing fascination. Despite their vastly different backgrounds, Sophie and Isabella seemed to connect naturally, sharing the kind of easy conversation that suggested they could become genuine friends given the opportunity. "Do you want to see something cool?" Sophie asked Isabella as they walked toward the library's exit. "I've been working on this graphic design project that shows the mathematical patterns in different types of flowers." Isabella's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? I've been painting flowers too, but I never thought about the math behind them." "Math is everywhere in art," Sophie said enthusiastically. "The golden ratio, Fibonacci sequences, fractal patterns. It's like nature is this incredible artist that uses math as its paintbrush. Listening to Sophie explain complex mathematical concepts with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a beloved hobby, Natalie began to understand why the teacher spoke so highly of this girl. Despite her modest circumstances, Sophie possessed a brilliant mind and a genuine passion for learning that transcended economic limitations. As they reached the school's entrance, Frank, the security guard, smiled warmly at their little group. "Glad we found everyone safe and sound," he said to Asher. "Sophie's a good kid. She was very polite when I checked on her earlier, told me she was working on homework and would be fine until her dad arrived." "She's very independent," Asher said with obvious pride, ruffling Sophie's hair affectionately. "Sometimes too independent for her own good." Standing in the school's entrance, with the evening light fading outside and two 12-year-old girls chattering excitedly about the intersection of art and mathematics, Natalie felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in years, she was part of a moment that wasn't scheduled or managed or designed to achieve a specific outcome. She was simply present, listening to her daughter engage with ideas and people in a way that revealed parts of Isabella's personality that Natalie had never seen before. And in that moment, she began to understand that perhaps the most valuable education Isabella could receive had nothing to do with prestigious schools or exclusive opportunities. Maybe what her daughter needed most was exactly what Sophie seemed to have in abundance. A parent who was genuinely present, who celebrated her interests and supported her dreams, who made her feel seen and valued for who she was rather than what she might become. As they stood in the school parking lot, preparing to say goodbye and return to their separate worlds, Sophie looked up at her father with the kind of earnest expression that always preceded her most important questions. "Dad," she said quietly, "could Isabella maybe come over for dinner sometime? I want to show her the mathematical art program I've been working on, and she could show me her painting techniques." The simple request hung in the evening air like a bridge neither family had expected to encounter. Asher glanced at Natalie, unsure how a billionaire tech mogul would respond to an invitation to their modest apartment. Natalie, for her part, found herself facing a choice that felt more significant than any business decision she'd ever made. Natalie began, then stopped, looking down at Isabella's hopeful face. Her daughter's eyes held an expression she hadn't seen in months. Genuine excitement about spending time with a peer, enthusiasm for sharing her artistic interests, the kind of social connection that had been missing from Isabella's carefully orchestrated but emotionally sterile life. "Please, Mom," Isabella asked softly. "Sophie understands art and math, and she doesn't care about designer clothes or expensive vacations. She just wants to talk about ideas." The longing in her daughter's voice was unmistakable, and Natalie realized with a painful clarity that Isabella had been starving for exactly this kind of authentic friendship. Her daughter moved through a world of privilege where relationships often felt transactional, where playdates were arranged by assistants and social interactions happened at events designed to network and impress. But here was an opportunity for something real, something based on shared interests and genuine connection rather than social status. Of course, Natalie heard herself saying. The words emerging before her rational mind could catalogue all the reasons why this was complicated. That sounds wonderful. Sophie's face lit up with joy, but it was Isabella's reaction that truly broke Natalie's heart. Her daughter looked genuinely surprised, as if she hadn't expected her mother to say yes, as if she'd grown accustomed to disappointment in matters that involved Natalie's time and attention. "Really?" Isabella asked, and the hope in her voice was almost unbearable. "Really?" Natalie confirmed, and found herself smiling at her daughter's excitement. "When would work for you, Asher?" Asher looked equally surprised by the turn of events, but pleased. "How about this weekend, Saturday afternoon? I could make lunch, and the girls could work on their art projects." "That sounds perfect," Natalie replied, then paused as a thought occurred to her. "Actually, would it be okay if I came too? I'd love to see more of Sophie's mathematical art, and I realize I haven't really looked at Isabella's recent work the way I should have." The admission cost her something to make, this acknowledgement that she'd been failing as a mother in ways that a stranger had managed to succeed in just a few hours. But Isabella's face transformed with such radiant happiness that Natalie knew she'd made the right choice, regardless of how vulnerable it made her feel. "You want to come to our apartment?" Sophie asked, clearly trying to process the idea of a billionaire CEO visiting their modest home. "Very much," Natalie said, and meant it. "If that's okay with you and your dad." Asher nodded, though she could see him already mentally cataloguing everything he'd need to clean and prepare. "Of course, we'd be honored to have you." As they exchanged phone numbers and made plans for Saturday, Natalie felt her business phone buzzing insistently in her purse. The vibrations were relentless, urgent, demanding her immediate attention in the way that had governed her life for so many years. But for the first time she could remember, the pull of work felt less compelling than the conversation happening right in front of her. "Mom," Isabella said suddenly, looking at her with eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Your phone is buzzing." "I know," Natalie replied, making no move to answer it. "Aren't you going to check it?" The question hung between them, loaded with the weight of countless similar moments when Natalie had chosen the demanding urgency of business over the quiet importance of her daughter's presence. Isabella was testing her, not maliciously, but with the protective caution of someone who had learned not to expect too much. "No," Natalie said firmly, reaching into her purse and switching the phone to silent without even looking at the screen. "Whatever it is can wait. This is more important." The effect of her words on Isabella was immediate and profound. Her daughter's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief, of gratitude, of a hope that had been buried under years of disappointment finally being allowed to surface. In that moment, Natalie saw clearly how many times she had failed this basic test of priorities, how often she had communicated through her actions that business would always come first. "You mean that?" Isabella whispered. "I mean it," Natalie said, pulling her daughter into a hug that felt more genuine than any physical contact they'd shared in months. "You are the most important thing in my life, Isabella. I'm sorry it's taken me so long to show you that." Standing nearby, Asher and Sophie watched this emotional exchange with the sensitivity of people who understood the significance of small moments. They had lived through their own struggles with loss and adaptation, and they recognized the courage it took for both mother and daughter to be vulnerable with each other. "Mrs. Price," Sophie said softly, her voice carrying the wisdom that sometimes emerges from children who have faced difficulties beyond their years. "My mom died when I was 9. And the thing I remember most about her wasn't the big stuff. It was the little moments when she chose to pay attention to me instead of whatever else was happening. Those moments felt like magic. The simple observation, delivered with such gentle honesty, hit Natalie with the force of absolute truth. Sophie was offering her the gift of perspective from someone who had lost what Natalie was in danger of throwing away through neglect and misplaced priorities. "Thank you for telling me that," Natalie said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly what I needed to hear." As they finally prepared to part ways, with plans firmly in place for Saturday's lunch, Isabella surprised everyone by hugging Sophie goodbye, a gesture of genuine friendship that transcended their different backgrounds and circumstances. Watching her daughter engage so naturally with another person, seeing the joy on Isabella's face as she talked excitedly about their upcoming visit, Natalie felt something crack open in her chest. For years, she had told herself that working so hard was for Isabella's benefit, that building a business empire was her way of ensuring her daughter's future security and opportunities. But standing in this school parking lot, watching Isabella beam with happiness over the simple prospect of sharing lunch and art projects with a new friend, Natalie realized that she had been giving her daughter everything except what she actually needed. Isabella didn't need more money or grander opportunities or a more successful mother. She needed presence. She needed attention. She needed to feel valued for who she was, rather than managed like another project in Natalie's carefully organized life. "See you Saturday," Sophie called out as she and Asher walked toward their old Honda. "See you Saturday," Isabella called back, waving enthusiastically. As Natalie and Isabella got into the Tesla for the drive home, the silence between them felt different than it had that morning. Instead of the awkward distance that had characterized their relationship for months, there was a tentative warmth, a sense of possibility that hadn't existed before. "Mom," Isabella said as they pulled out of the parking lot. "Yes, sweetheart? Thank you for turning off your phone." The simple statement contained multitudes: gratitude, hope, and the beginning of trust that perhaps things could be different between them. Natalie reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling the fragile start of the connection she had been too busy to nurture. "Thank you for reminding me what matters most," she replied. And as they drove through the evening streets toward their penthouse, Natalie found herself thinking not about the meetings she'd missed or the calls she'd ignored, but about Saturday afternoon and the chance to see her daughter through the eyes of people who had already recognized Isabella's worth in ways that Natalie was only beginning to understand. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to something that had nothing to do with business success and everything to do with the simple joy of being present for the person who mattered most. Saturday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn sunshine that made everything feel possible. Natalie had spent the morning in a state of nervous energy that was completely foreign to her. Not the sharp anxiety of business pressure, but the flutter of anticipation mixed with uncertainty that came from stepping outside her comfort zone in pursuit of something genuinely important. She had changed clothes 3 times, torn between wanting to look approachable and not wanting to appear condescending by dressing down too obviously. Finally, Isabella had appeared in her doorway with an amused smile and suggested dark jeans and a simple sweater. "You know, Mom, like a normal person wears on weekends." Now, as they stood outside Asher's apartment building with a bouquet of flowers and a box of gourmet chocolates that Natalie hoped weren't too extravagant, she felt more nervous than she had before her first board presentation as a young entrepreneur. "It's going to be fine," Isabella said, seeming to sense her mother's anxiety. "Sophie and her dad are really nice people." "I know," Natalie replied, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was nervous about. Perhaps it was the prospect of being evaluated not as a CEO or a business leader, but simply as a person, and potentially being found wanting. Asher answered the door with Sophie beside him, both wearing welcoming smiles that immediately put Natalie at ease. The apartment smelled like something wonderful was cooking, and she could see through the kitchen doorway that the small dining table had been set with care, complete with a mason jar filled with wildflowers as a centerpiece. "Welcome," Asher said warmly, accepting the flowers with genuine pleasure. "These are beautiful, thank you, and you really didn't need to bring anything." "I wanted to contribute something," Natalie said, then paused as she really looked around the apartment in daylight. What struck her wasn't what was missing. The expensive furniture, the designer accessories, the status symbols that filled her own home. But what was present? Every surface held evidence of a life being actively lived. Sophie's artwork, displayed on the refrigerator with obvious pride. Books stacked on tables and shelves with bookmarks protruding from multiple volumes, a chess set mid-game on the coffee table, and photographs that captured genuine moments of joy rather than posed perfection. "Sophie's been working on something special to show you," Asher said, leading them toward a corner of the living room that had been converted into a makeshift art studio. "She's been up since dawn, putting the finishing touches on it." The corner workspace was ingenious in its efficiency. A desk made from a door and filing cabinets, walls covered with corkboard for displaying work in progress, and shelves constructed from boards and brackets that held art supplies organized with military precision. It was the kind of creative space that maximized limited resources through ingenuity and love, and Natalie found herself more impressed by its thoughtful design than she had ever been by the expensive art studios she'd seen in her wealthy friends' homes. "Mrs. Price," Sophie said, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and nervousness, "I wanted to show you something that combines Isabella's love of flowers with the mathematical concepts I've been exploring." She led them to a computer screen that displayed what could only be described as digital magic. Sophie had created a program that generated botanical illustrations based on mathematical formulas, with each flower's petals following Fibonacci sequences, their colors shifting according to algorithmic patterns, and their growth animated to show the mathematical principles underlying natural beauty. "Sophie," Natalie breathed, genuinely awestruck. "This is extraordinary. This is the kind of innovative thinking that major tech companies would pay millions to develop." Sophie beamed at the praise, but what happened next took Natalie completely by surprise. Isabella stepped forward to an easel that had been positioned nearby, revealing a watercolor painting that perfectly captured the essence of Sophie's digital flowers, but rendered them in the organic, flowing style that only human hands could create. "I painted what Sophie's program made me see," Isabella explained quietly. "She showed me that math isn't just numbers. It's the language that describes beauty. So I tried to paint that language." Looking at the two girls' collaborative work, Sophie's brilliant technical innovation paired with Isabella's artistic interpretation, Natalie felt something click into place in her mind. These 12-year-olds had created something together that neither could have achieved alone, combining different strengths and perspectives to produce something genuinely remarkable. But it was Asher's reaction that truly stunned her. He wasn't taking photos to post on social media or calling relatives to brag about his daughter's achievement. He was simply present, listening with genuine interest as Sophie explained her work, asking thoughtful questions that encouraged her to dig deeper into her own thinking, and offering quiet encouragement that felt like the most natural thing in the world. "How do you do it?" Natalie found herself asking him quietly while the girls worked together to adjust the program's parameters. "Do what?" Asher replied, looking genuinely confused. "Make it look so easy. Being present, being engaged, making her feel like she's the most important thing in the world." Asher glanced at Sophie, who was animatedly explaining something to Isabella about fractal patterns, then back at Natalie. "Because she is the most important thing in the world. My world, anyway." The simple statement hit Natalie like a revelation. It wasn't a technique or a strategy or a skill that could be learned from a parenting book. It was a fundamental orientation toward what mattered most, a choosing of priorities that put relationship before achievement, presence before productivity. "I've been doing everything wrong," she said softly, the words escaping before she could. "Stop them. I don't think that's true," Asher replied gently. "I think you've been doing what you thought was best with the information you had. But maybe now you have different information." As if summoned by their conversation, Isabella appeared at Natalie's side with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Mom, look what Sophie taught me to do." She led Natalie to the computer, where a new image was forming on the screen, a digital flower that combined Sophie's mathematical precision with Isabella's artistic sensibility. The petals followed perfect geometric patterns, but their colors flowed and blended with the organic beauty that characterized Isabella's paintings. "I created this," Isabella said, her voice filled with wonder. "I used Sophie's program, but I added my own artistic choices. It's like speaking in two languages at the same time." Looking at her daughter's glowing face, seeing the pride and accomplishment in Isabella's eyes, Natalie realized something that changed everything. This moment, this pure joy in creative collaboration, this excitement about learning and growing and sharing ideas, this was what Isabella had been missing in her carefully orchestrated life of privilege and opportunity. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Natalie said, and meant it more than any praise she'd ever offered. "You and Sophie make an incredible team." "We do," Isabella agreed, grinning at Sophie. "We're thinking about entering the regional STEAM competition together. Sophie would handle the technical programming and I would do the visual design and presentation." "That sounds amazing," Natalie said, then paused as the implications sank in. A regional competition would require time, commitment, and ongoing collaboration between the girls. It would mean regular contact between their families, shared transportation to events, the kind of sustained connection that would weave their very different worlds together. 6 months ago, the prospect would have seemed impossible. A billionaire tech mogul and a working-class contractor finding common ground beyond a brief social interaction. But standing in this warm apartment, watching their daughters create something beautiful together, seeing the genuine friendship that had sparked between Sophie and Isabella, Natalie realized that perhaps the most important connections in life had nothing to do with social status or wealth. They had to do with shared values, mutual respect, and the recognition that love, real, unconditional, present love, was the rarest and most valuable commodity in any world. "I'd like to help," she heard herself saying. "With the competition, I mean. However I can." Sophie's eyes widened with surprise and delight. "Really? You'd want to help us?" "I'd be honored to help you," Natalie replied, and realized she meant it completely. "You girls have created something remarkable here, and I think the world deserves to see it. As they gathered around the dining table for lunch, homemade soup and sandwiches that tasted better than any restaurant meal Natalie could remember, she found herself thinking about the morning's missed conference calls and ignored emails. For the first time in her career, the demands of business felt less compelling than the conversation happening right in front of her. Isabella was laughing at something Sophie had said, her face bright with the kind of happiness that no amount of money could purchase. And watching her daughter in this moment of pure joy, Natalie finally understood what had been missing from both their lives. It wasn't success or achievement or recognition. It was simply this: the choice to be present, to pay attention, to value. Relationship over productivity and connection over accomplishment. And as they spent the afternoon sharing stories and dreams around Asher's modest dining table, Natalie realized that she hadn't just found her daughter a friend. She had discovered what it meant to truly live rather than simply succeed. 3 weeks after that first Saturday lunch, Natalie found herself doing something she hadn't done in over a decade, leaving the office at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday evening to attend a parent-teacher conference. Not sending Marcus in her place, not joining virtually from another meeting, but physically present and giving her full attention to understanding Isabella's academic and social progress. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Old habits of prioritizing urgent business demands over important personal moments died hard, and Natalie had stumbled several times in those first weeks. But each time she chose presence over productivity, each time she put her phone aside to really listen to Isabella, the connection between them grew stronger and more authentic. The most significant change had come from an unexpected source: Sophie and Isabella's STEAM competition project. What had started as a friendship between two 12-year-olds had evolved into a collaboration that required regular coordination between their families. Natalie found herself texting with Asher about pickup times and project deadlines, sharing resources and ideas, and gradually building the kind of partnership that transcended their vastly different economic circumstances. "Mrs. Price," said Dr. Catherine Williams, Isabella's art teacher, as they sat in the bright studio classroom where Isabella spent her happiest school hours. "I have to tell you, the change in Isabella over the past few weeks has been remarkable. She's always been talented, but now she seems lighter somehow, more confident in sharing her ideas." Natalie nodded, feeling a warm glow of pride mixed with the lingering guilt of knowing how long she'd been absent from these moments. "She's been working on an exciting project with her friend Sophie. It's given her a new outlet for creativity." "Yes, she's told me about the mathematical art program," Dr. Williams said with genuine enthusiasm. "But I think the change goes deeper than just having a creative project. Isabella seems more grounded, more secure. She's been participating more in class discussions and offering to help other students with their work." As they discussed Isabella's progress and potential, Natalie found herself sharing details about her daughter's interests and personality that she was only just beginning to understand herself. The conversation felt natural in a way that her previous interactions with school personnel never had, not because she was managing Isabella's academic trajectory, but because she was genuinely invested in her daughter's happiness and growth. After the conference, Natalie drove to Asher's apartment to pick up Isabella, who had been working on the competition project with Sophie while Natalie attended the meeting. It had become their Tuesday routine over the past few weeks. Asher would pick up both girls from school, supervise their project work, and provide them with an after-school snack, while Natalie finished her essential meetings before transitioning to mom mode. The arrangement worked beautifully for everyone involved. Sophie got additional supervision and support during the hours when Asher was sometimes still finishing work sites. Isabella got dedicated time to work on something she was passionate about, and Natalie got the flexibility to maintain her business responsibilities while still prioritizing her daughter's needs. "How did the conference go?" Asher asked as he opened the apartment door, wiping paint-stained hands on a dish towel. "Really well," Natalie replied, accepting his offer of coffee and settling into the comfortable routine they'd developed over their weekly interactions. "Dr. Williams says Isabella seems more confident and engaged. I think having Sophie as a friend has given her permission to be more herself at school." "Sophie's been different too," Asher said, pouring coffee into two mismatched mugs that Natalie had grown fond of. "She's always been brilliant, but working with Isabella has shown her that intelligence can be collaborative. She started reaching out to other kids in ways she never did before." They could hear the girls' voices from the living room, where Sophie was explaining something technical, while Isabella asked thoughtful questions that pushed both of them to think more deeply. The sound of their collaboration had become the soundtrack to these Tuesday evenings. a reminder of what was possible when people from different worlds found common ground. "I have something to tell you," Natalie said, setting down her coffee mug and looking at Asher with an expression that was both nervous and excited. "I've made a decision about work." Asher raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. "I'm stepping back from day-to-day operations at Price Technologies," she said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating as she spoke them aloud. "I'm promoting my COO to CEO and transitioning to a chairman role that will allow me to focus on strategic vision without the constant operational demands." The decision had been brewing for weeks, crystallizing as she watched Isabella flourish under the influence of consistent parental attention and genuine friendship. Natalie had built her company to create security and opportunity, but she'd realized that the most important opportunity she could give Isabella was simply her presence. "That's a huge decision," Asher said carefully. "Are you sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Natalie replied. "I built Price Technologies to provide for Isabella's future, but I almost lost her present in the process. The company will be fine, probably better, with leadership that isn't constantly torn between business demands and family priorities." What she didn't say, but what they both understood, was that this decision had been influenced by watching Asher parent Sophie with such consistent presence and attention. He'd shown her that success as a parent wasn't measured by the opportunities you could provide, but by the relationship you built day by day, choice by choice. "Isabella doesn't know yet," Natalie continued. "I want to tell her when we get home, tonight. But I wanted you to know first because..." She paused, searching for the right words. "Because you've become important to us, to both of us." The admission hung between them, carrying implications that neither was quite ready to examine fully. Over the past weeks, their practical partnership in supporting the girls' friendship had evolved into something deeper, a mutual respect and growing affection that transcended their original circumstances. Asher was quiet for a moment, then smiled with the warmth that had first made Isabella feel safe in his apartment. "You've become important to us too. Sophie talks about you and Isabella constantly. You've given her something she's never had before." "What's that?" "A sense of what family can look like when it expands beyond just two people," he said softly. "Sophie lost her mom when she was 9, and it's been just us ever since. But watching her with Isabella, seeing how naturally they support each other, it's shown both of us that family doesn't have to be limited by biology or circumstances." The conversation was interrupted by the girls' excited voices calling them to come see their latest breakthrough. Sophie and Isabella had solved a technical challenge that had been frustrating them for days, and their combined excitement was infectious. "Look, Mom," Isabella called out, gesturing toward the computer screen where their mathematical flowers were blooming in increasingly complex and beautiful patterns. "Sophie figured out how to make the colors respond to music, and I designed a sequence that creates different emotional moods." As Natalie and Asher crowded around the computer to admire the girls' work, she felt a profound sense of rightness about the choices she'd been making. This was what success actually looked like, not the corner office or the magazine covers, or the board presentations, but this moment of shared joy and collaborative achievement. "We're ready for the competition," Sophie announced with quiet confidence. "Our project combines art and science and technology in a way that I don't think anyone else will expect. We make a good team," Isabella added, grinning at her friend. "Sophie makes me think bigger, and I help her see the beauty in the patterns." Looking at their daughter's partnership, Natalie and Asher exchanged a glance that carried its own unspoken understanding. The girls weren't the only ones who had discovered the power of collaboration, the way different strengths could complement each other to create something neither could achieve alone. As the evening wound down and they prepared to head home, Isabella hugged Sophie goodbye with the ease of sisters rather than simply friends. And watching her daughter in this moment of pure contentment, Natalie knew that stepping back from Price Technologies wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment in the only success that truly mattered, the success of showing up day after day for the people who needed her most. The morning of the regional STEAM competition arrived with the kind of nervous energy that transforms ordinary families into sports teams preparing for the championship game. In her penthouse, Natalie found herself checking and rechecking the supplies Isabella would need, while across town, Asher was doing the same thing in his modest apartment with Sophie's materials. What made this particular morning extraordinary wasn't just the competition itself, but what it represented. The first major test of whether the changes they'd all made over the past 2 months could withstand real-world pressure. Would Natalie's commitment to prioritizing Isabella hold up when business crises demanded her attention? Would the partnership between their families survive the stress of public scrutiny? Would the girls' collaboration flourish or crumble under the pressure of formal evaluation? "Mom, you're more nervous than I am," Isabella observed with amusement as she watched Natalie fuss over the presentation materials for the 3rd time. "I just want everything to be perfect for you," Natalie replied, then paused as she heard her own words. 6 months ago, her definition of perfect would have involved hiring professional consultants, purchasing the most expensive equipment, and leveraging her business connections to ensure Isabella had every possible advantage. Now, be perfect meant something entirely different. It meant being present, being supportive, and trusting that Isabella and Sophie's genuine collaboration was more valuable than any external advantage money could buy. The competition was being held at the convention center downtown, and as they drove through the morning traffic, Natalie's phone began its familiar, urgent buzzing. A glance at the screen showed multiple missed calls from her newly appointed CEO, urgent emails about a potential security breach that could affect thousands of clients, and text messages from board members requesting immediate video conferences. 6 months ago, she would have pulled over to take the calls, conducted the video conference from the car while Isabella waited patiently in the passenger seat, and arrived at the competition distracted by the weight of unresolved business crises. But today, she switched the phone to airplane mode and put it in her purse without hesitation. "The CEO can handle it," she said, more to herself than to Isabella. "That's why I promoted her." "And if she can't?" Isabella asked, testing her mother's resolve with the gentle curiosity of someone who had learned not to expect too much. "Then she'll figure it out, or she'll wait until after your competition to brief me on the situation," Natalie replied firmly. "Today is about you and Sophie, and the amazing work you've created together. Everything else can wait." When they arrived at the convention center, they found Asher and Sophie waiting near the entrance, both looking excited and nervous in equal measure. Sophie clutched a laptop case that contained months of their collaborative work, while Asher carried a poster board that Isabella had painted to complement Sophie's technical presentation. "Ready for this?" Asher asked as they approached, and Natalie noticed that he looked as proud and nervous as any parent watching their offspring compete on a major stage. "We're ready," Sophie said with quiet confidence, then grinned at Isabella. "We've got this." The competition space was impressive. Dozens of booths where young innovators from across the region displayed their projects, with judges moving systematically through the exhibits to evaluate everything from technical complexity to practical application to presentation skills. Some teams had clearly spent thousands of dollars on elaborate displays and professional-grade equipment, while others, like Sophie and Isabella, relied on creativity and genuine innovation to make their mark. What struck Natalie most powerfully as they set up their booth was how naturally Isabella and Sophie worked together. There was no competition between them for attention or credit, no jockeying for position or dominance. Instead, they moved with the easy coordination of people who trusted each other completely, with Sophie handling the technical explanations, while Isabella guided visitors through the artistic and visual elements of their work. "This is remarkable," said Dr. Jennifer Chen, one of the competition judges, as she stopped at their booth. "You've created something that bridges the gap between analytical and creative thinking in a way that I rarely see, even in graduate level research." Sophie beamed as she explained the mathematical principles underlying their digital flower program, while Isabella demonstrated how those same principles could be translated into traditional artistic media. Together, they showed Dr. Chen how their collaboration had produced something neither could have created independently. "What gave you the idea to work together?" Dr. Chen asked. Sophie and Isabella exchanged a glance that spoke of inside jokes and shared understanding. Then Sophie answered, "We realized that Isabella sees beauty in patterns that I only understood as numbers, and I could create technical tools that helped Isabella's artistic vision become interactive and dynamic. But the best part," Isabella added, "is that we both learned something new about our own work by seeing it through someone else's eyes." As Dr. Chen moved on to the next booth, clearly impressed, Natalie felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with winning or losing the competition. Isabella was thriving in a way that no amount of expensive private tutoring or exclusive opportunities had ever achieved. She was confident, articulate, and genuinely happy in a way that radiated from her like sunshine. Throughout the morning, as judges and visitors cycled through their booth, Natalie found herself watching not just Isabella, but also the dynamic between the two families they'd become. Asher moved easily between offering quiet encouragement to Sophie and engaging in natural conversation with other parents, his genuine warmth and lack of pretension making him popular with everyone he met. Meanwhile, several other parents had clearly recognized Natalie from business magazines and news coverage, but instead of feeling the familiar pressure to network or represent her professional image, she found herself simply enjoying conversations about their daughter's friendship and collaborative work. "You must be so proud," said one mother whose son was competing in the robotics category. "Isabella and Sophie's presentation is getting rave reviews from the judges." "I am proud," Natalie replied, and meant it completely. "But more than that, I'm grateful. This competition has shown me what Isabella is capable of when she's given the right support and partnership." When the results were announced that afternoon, Sophie and Isabella's project took second place in the interdisciplinary category, an achievement that prompted cheers from the small group of family and friends who had come to support them. But what mattered more than the ribbon or the recognition was the way Isabella and Sophie hugged each other with genuine joy, celebrating not just their own success, but their shared accomplishment. "We did it," Isabella whispered to Sophie, and the simple statement carried the weight of everything they'd overcome and achieved together. As they gathered their materials and prepared to leave the convention center, Natalie's phone emerged from airplane mode to reveal 17 missed calls and 43 unread emails. 6 months ago, the backlog would have sent her into a panic of urgent catch-up mode, but today she glanced at the screen and simply turned it off again. "Ice cream celebration?" Asher suggested, and the girls cheered their approval. "Ice cream celebration," Natalie agreed, and realized that for the first time in her adult life, she had chosen joy over urgency, presence over productivity, and the simple pleasure of celebrating her daughter's happiness over the demanding complexity of business crisis management, and the world hadn't ended. In fact, it felt like it was just beginning. 1 year later, on a sun-drenched Saturday afternoon in May, Natalie stood in the backyard of a house she never could have imagined owning. Not because she couldn't afford it, but because she never would have thought to want it. The modest 2-story home in Asher's neighborhood was smaller than her penthouse, older than any property she'd ever considered, and absolutely perfect for the life she'd discovered she actually wanted to live. The backyard was filled with the sounds of celebration. Isabella and Sophie, now 13 and more inseparable than ever, were hosting a barbecue to celebrate their acceptance into the prestigious summer STEAM program at Stanford. Both girls had been selected for the competitive program based on their award-winning collaboration from the previous year's competition, but more importantly, they'd been chosen as a team, their partnership now recognized as one of their greatest strengths. "Can you believe this is our life now?" Asher asked, appearing beside Natalie with 2 glasses of lemonade and the kind of smile that had become as familiar to her as her own reflection. "Some days I still can't," Natalie admitted, accepting the lemonade and leaning into the warmth of his presence. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be living in a neighborhood where people know each other's names and borrow cups of sugar, I would have thought they were describing someone else's life." The transition hadn't been seamless. Moving from a penthouse to a family neighborhood, adjusting from CEO to strategic advisor, learning to be a hands-on mother instead of a distant provider. Each change had required courage and conscious choice. But watching Isabella flourish, in an environment where she was valued for her character rather than her connections, had made every adjustment worthwhile. "Dad, Mom, come see this!" Sophie called from across the yard, where she and Isabella had set up a demonstration of their latest project, an interactive art installation that responded to voice commands by creating visual representations of emotions. Natalie smiled at Sophie's casual use of mom, a development that had evolved naturally over the months as their 2 families had blended into something unprecedented but undeniably real. The legal formalities of adoption were still in progress, but in every way that mattered, Sophie had become her daughter, just as surely as Isabella had become Asher's. As they walked across the yard to admire the girl's latest innovation, Natalie marveled at how different her definition of success had become. The project Sophie and Isabella were demonstrating wouldn't generate billions in revenue or disrupt entire industries, but it would bring joy to the community center where they'd volunteered to install it, providing interactive art therapy for local families who couldn't afford expensive programs. "Watch this," Isabella said excitedly, speaking the word joy into the microphone. Immediately the screen bloomed with golden spirals and dancing patterns that seemed to capture the essence of happiness in mathematical beauty. "And this," Sophie added, saying, "friendship." The display shifted to show intertwining blue and green forms that moved in harmony, creating new patterns together while maintaining their individual characteristics. "It's extraordinary," said Dr. Williams, Isabella's former art teacher who had become a family friend and was now helping the girls prepare for their Stanford program. "You've created something that makes abstract emotions visible and tangible. The best part," Isabella explained, "is that we're going to teach other kids how to build their own versions. Sophie wrote the program so it can be modified and personalized, and I created art templates that can be adapted for different styles and preferences." Watching her daughter, both her daughters really, explain their work with such passion and generosity, Natalie felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with market cap or quarterly earnings. These girls were growing into young women who understood that true innovation served others, that the best success was shared success, and that collaboration could achieve what competition never could. "Mrs. Price," said Marcus, who had arrived an hour earlier with his husband and their 2 adopted sons. Marcus had transitioned seamlessly from being Natalie's assistant to becoming a family friend, and his presence at their celebration felt like a bridge between her old life and her new one. "I have news from Price Technologies." Natalie tensed slightly. old habits of anxiety still triggered by business updates. But Asha's hand found hers with reassuring warmth. The new cybersecurity protocol you designed is being implemented by the Department of Education, Marcus continued with obvious pride. Your strategic consultation work is making digital learning safer for millions of students nationwide. The news brought genuine satisfaction, but not the addictive rush of ego and achievement that business success had once provided. Instead, Natalie felt the quieter pleasure of knowing that her expertise was being used to protect young people, to create safer spaces for learning and growth. It was meaningful work that complemented rather than competed with her role as a mother and partner. "That's wonderful," she said simply, then turned her attention back to Sophie and Isabella's demonstration as a small crowd of neighbors and friends gathered to watch. As the afternoon progressed, Natalie found herself observing the easy interactions between all the people who had become part of their extended family. Dr. Williams was deep in conversation with Marcus about educational technology. Several neighbors had stopped by to congratulate the girls on their Stanford acceptance. Sophie's art teacher from her new school was discussing collaborative learning techniques with Isabella's math tutor. This was what community looked like, not the carefully curated social events of her previous life, but the organic connections that formed when people chose to be present for each other's joys and struggles. "Penny for your thoughts," Asha said, settling beside her on the porch steps as the celebration continued around them. "I was thinking about that first day," Natalie replied, "when you accidentally picked up Isabella from school. If someone had told me then that a simple mistake would lead to all this, would you have believed them? Never," she said with a laugh. "I would have thought it was the plot of a romantic comedy, too unrealistic to be true." And now, Natalie looked out at the yard where Isabella and Sophie were teaching Marcus's sons how to use their emotion visualization program, their faces bright with the joy of sharing knowledge. She thought about the life she'd built with Asha, not through dramatic gestures or grand romantic declarations, but through thousands of small choices to prioritize relationship over achievement, presence over productivity. "Now I know that the best things in life don't follow logical business plans," she said. "They grow from unexpected moments, from choosing to stay open when it would be easier to close off, from trusting that love multiplies when you share it instead of hoarding it." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded Natalie of Isabella's paintings, the four of them, Asha, Natalie, Sophie and Isabella, sat together on the porch steps, watching their friends and neighbors gradually head home. "You know what's funny?" Isabella said, leaning against Natalie's shoulder with the casual affection that had taken months to rebuild, but now felt as natural as breathing. "A year ago, I would never have believed I could be this happy." "What changed?" Sophie asked, though she was smiling as if she already knew the answer. "Everything," Isabella replied simply, "but mostly people started choosing to show up." And sitting there in the golden evening light, surrounded by the family they'd accidentally discovered and intentionally built, Natalie realized that Isabella was right. The greatest transformation hadn't come from changing circumstances or achieving goals. It had come from the simple, revolutionary act of showing up consistently and completely for the people who mattered most. Sometimes the biggest mistakes really do become the most beautiful beginnings, and sometimes a wrong turn leads you exactly where you were always meant to be. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.